in relation to your notion about elites manipulating polarization for their own political purposes, I mean, one way in which I sort of tend to describe this is in relation to the politics of fear. And I don't know, I can't recall you sort of actually using that term, but is that a good way of grasping what happens? That is that, populations that are a little bit nervous about some of the grievances and so forth that are fueling polarization are susceptible to a politics of fear. I mean, is this helpful or not helpful in terms of your own analysis?
I think that we haven't really burrowed into this, and that's a very good suggestion. But I think that what we see is certainly societies in which segments of the population worry that they're losing out. I'm not sure whether that's what you mean by fear of it or not, but that they feel like their position is eroding. And that provides very fertile territory for the populist autocrat to mobilize support. So sort of fear of the other, fear that you're being replaced, fear that your nation is being taken over by aliens. All of that, I think, is part of the kind of the rhetoric and the technique of the populist stoking polarization. Yes.
I mean, in some way, it feels like fear is the taproot, because fear is beneath everything else, kind of the fire that's feeding all of this. And in some way, it's an existential fear of not being. Either I don't be, or my community doesn't be, and that's very threatening to people. And I wonder sometimes if that existential fear is not multiplied now by the climate crisis, whether consciously or unconsciously. There is a terror everywhere of long-term existence for our species, our families, etc. And if somehow that's not in the pool of fear that's promoting all the grievances and exacerbating them. Don't have any proof of that, but it's an interesting thought.
Paula, look, I mean, there's a very rich set of ideas that are floating around this conversation, I have to say, because clearly the idea of effective polarization bears some family resemblance to ideas of fear, and is somehow also linked to your earlier idea about dehumanization in a strange way, because at the same time that we're fearful of this other, we're also dehumanizing them. And we've seen that operative in a number of these settings. But I do think it's important to pull back to the political realm again, because what we find is distinctive about this process of polarization is the way that it ends up leading to, I think, or validating a majoritarian view of democracy. Mm-hmm. And, when you write a book with someone, everyone has their little hobby horse. Bob has his and I have mine. But I think that this majoritarian conception of democracy is actually a unifying theme undergirding the backsliding events that we've seen, the backsliding cases. And by majoritarian conception of democracy, I'm talking about something which actually has a long history and pedigree in what we call the Republican tradition. Mm-hmm. But the idea is the majority should rule. Mm-hmm. And what majorities want, they should be able to get. And if a community agrees on X and that community is a majority, then it should be able to do X. And if you think about the way we conceptualize liberal democracy, it's actually quite antithetical to that idea, because it's based on, first of all, the rule of law, that majorities need to be subject to, a broader constitutional order and legal order that's enforced. And second of all, that individuals have rights that are really at the core of the system. And that a majority does not have the right to take away rights. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard this term, the right to rights, that this is quite fundamental to how we think of liberal democracy operating. And in the backsliding cases, to varying degrees, you see majoritarian impulses where, you know, the political processes of checks and balances just get in the way of us doing what we need to do. We need to sweep those aside in order to accomplish the objectives that we want to accomplish. These niceties of protecting rights, you know, that's, look what happens, chaos if you protect individual rights, the right to protest and so on. So I think that discourse to me is particularly interesting piece of Backsliding, a majoritarian conception of democracy.
In relation to that, I mean, would the kind of political system or kind of democracy make a difference here? I mean, here in New Zealand, we moved from first past the post to a mixed member proportional system, where you guarantee a wider representation and minority perspectives are incorporated into that majoritarian situation. Is that something that makes a difference to whether or not, you know, you get backsliding occurring?
I think that institutional arrangements matter, and they matter in part because they affect the composition of the legislature. They matter, of course, because they also affect, you know, who gets elected as prime minister or president. But the composition of the legislature is very important. And so if you have an electoral system which is majoritarian, you know, first past the post, that is going to, you know, tend toward blocking out minorities. If you have proportional representation or other, you know, kind of other kinds of arrangements, that may be less likely. But let me make if I can, let me make a friendly amendment though to what Steph's argument about majoritarianism. A very large number of the 16 cases were ones in which neither the autocrat nor his party gained majorities. You know, the American system is a prime example of that.
Yeah.
In which institutional arrangements, sort of a large, more broadly understood, not simply in terms of the electoral arrangement, but the constitutional system, allowed minorities to control the political institutions. And that was true in a surprisingly large number of cases, where the autocrat did not win a majority. You know, it was a minority. So what do we mean by majoritarian in that context? I mean, what does that, you know, what does that convey? And I think that the amendment that I would add is that the majority means the majority of the real people, in quotes. In other words, there's a conception of the national community that is highly exclusionary. It doesn't include immigrants. It doesn't include people of color. It doesn't include other kinds of minorities. And so majoritarianism really is a way of smuggling in the notion that it's what the group that should really be the decisive group is some characteristics, some people who have shared ascribed characteristics. And so those are the real people, and that's the real majority.
And you can see that in the United States so clearly now with this struggle around who's the majority and what happens in states like California that have no longer have a white majority, and the panic people go into around all of that. It's a huge issue here and only going to get worse, I'm afraid.